Today, we are privileged to have a panel of subject matter experts with us to provide their perspectives on the utility and practice of strategic foresight across industry, consulting, academia, and government. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our three panelists for today's webinar. Sherelle Grisiak is a dedicated public servant with a long-standing track record as a foresight strategist and policy analyst. She was instrumental in establishing a Center for Strategic Foresight at the U.S. Government Accountability Office, and she currently serves as director of the center. Sherelle has also been recognized among the list of the world's top female futurists. Cho Kong is a scenarios practitioner and geopolitical analyst. He is an associate fellow in the Said Business School at the University of Oxford, where he teaches as a core faculty member in the Oxford Scenarios program. He's a distinguished international fellow of the Center for Strategic Futures, located within the government of Singapore. Cho brings 25 years of experience in foresight from his previous role as a senior member of the Scenarios team and chief political analyst for Shell plc. And Cole Oman is a foresight leader in the Office of the Future at Deloitte, a professional services firm with the stated purpose to make an impact that matters by creating trust and confidence in a more equitable society. In his role, he helps future-proof organizations and leads teams in the development of robust solutions to address the most significant challenges facing business and society today. Sherelle, Cho, and Cole, thank you so much for joining us today. We've structured our panel today as a panel discussion, our webinar today is a panel discussion, where our experts will answer a series of pre-selected questions to discuss key aspects of strategic foresight planning, research, training, and action. The second part of the panel will be devoted to answering audience questions. So we invite you to add your questions in the Q&A box at any time during the webinar. And if appropriate, please identify the speaker to whom your question is directed. I'll be moderating today's panel along with Dr. Jessica Stripe from the NIOSH Office of Research Integration. And so we'll get started. Our first question goes to all of our panelists, and it's related to developing a foresight approach. Foresight requires input from diverse disciplines. How do you foster effective collaboration between experts from various domains to create a holistic and well-rounded foresight approach? Sherelle, would you respond first?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. First and foremost, thank you for allowing us to be part of this panel discussion. Really excited to be here. And I hope that some of the content that we shared today through our responses will help others further along foresight within your entity or organization. So as Sarah mentioned, I have worked at the Department of Homeland Security, Health and Human Services at the OIG, as well as helping stand up foresight at the Department of Veterans Affairs and most recently at GAO. So my experience is mostly in federal government and helping either develop a strategic plan with foresight elements or standing up foresight shops. And what I've seen time and time and again, and I also saw it when coming to GAO, is the importance of various disciplines to have in the room, right? So GAO is a very unique entity. We audit the federal government, so the executive branch. So in simple terms, for every taxpayer dollar, GAO is subject to auditing to make sure that dollar performed, right? So we have 15 different mission teams with different diverse backgrounds. We have a high caliber of folks across the organization. And so we always make sure that we're working with each of the individual teams, right? And making sure that we're working with each of the different agencies. So the teams allows us to have that unique, different perspective. Additionally, we, like Sarah had mentioned, we started up the Center for Strategic Foresight at GAO in 2018, and the center was the standing stone for us to ensure that we were doing foresight across government and also helping Congress understand some of these emerging trends that were very important. So not only auditing the work and the performance of federal programs, but then also thinking forward and being more forward leaning. So with that, our center is very unique because we have 8 different fellows from across the world with different expertise, from social demographics to economics, technology, and all these different diverse disciplines allow us to get different perspectives of what's emerging, helps us get informed, making sure that we're networking across different sectors so that we're not just in one section, right? And this practice is not only just because of GAO's unique position, but also having worked at Department of Veterans Affairs, there's many things that impact a veteran. And so understanding that whole spectrum and having people from diverse backgrounds in a room is very important for us. So with that, I'll pause there to give my colleagues a chance also to respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherelle. Cho, what's your view on how to foster effective collaboration between experts?
So thank you, Sarah, and may I add my thanks to you and to NIOSH for this opportunity to engage with all of you and with your broader community through this webinar. So in answering your question, I'd just like to take 2 steps back to pose the question, what do we understand by foresight? Now, foresight means looking at the future, of course, and a very famous quote, which everyone I know in the scenarios community always cites incessantly, is a phrase taken from I'm told the Middle East proverb, but Middle Eastern friends of mine, Arab friends of mine, tell me it's actually from the Quran, and it expresses a simple fundamental truth in just a few words. And the quote is this: "He who foretells the future lies, even if he tells the truth." Close quote. So what's going on here? Are we in the business of packaging lies? Yes, we are, but they are lies which express a fundamental underlying truth. And we are using these lies or these fundamental or this fundamental understanding to impact on the mindset of, when I was working for Shell, my colleague who has to make a critical decision, a critical strategic decision, or in the case like now I'm doing consulting my client. So I'm trying to impact on that client. And it requires, of course, as Sherelle has pointed out, encompassing multiple perspectives, at each one of which expresses perhaps just a small part of that truth. So it's how do we actually gel all these different insights together into a single whole? That's really the essence of your question. And actually, what I would say to you is that when you look across, when you troll the experts around, you'll find that there are experts and experts. There's one category of expert who is so deep into his or her discipline that they cannot see the wood for the particular tree that they're focused on. There are others who can actually make the connections between their expertise and what other people tell them. Now, as someone who runs workshops to impact the minds of the critical decision makers, I have to try to find the latter. And while I may very much admire the former, they could be a Nobel Prize winning economist, for instance, I'm less keen. In fact, I'm not interested at all in bringing that person into the room to debate the issues with the decision maker. And let me be clear, it's not me putting out the foresight analysis to the decision maker. He or she needs to hear it straight from the horse's mouth. So that's that's where I begin by melding all these different insights together. I mean, just give it one. So 2 things. Some of you may have heard of Philip Tetlock and the work he's done on how good experts are at predicting the future. And what he discovered was that the more famous the expert, the worse his or her track record at getting it right. And that's actually quite understandable, because we all like certainty, and because we like certainty, we gravitate to the expert who sounds the most confident. So right now with what's going on now in the Middle East between Hamas and Israel, just look at the plethora of armchair generals that are online, on your TV screen or wherever, just propounding their views? How many of them actually know deeply what's going on? I remember the pandemic when you had a whole army of armchair epidemiologists pronouncing on what we should or shouldn't do. So let's be very clear. We like and we gravitate towards certainty, but that is a natural human bias which you need to be careful about. I always look for experts who say, I don't know, but I'd like to find out more. It's that hesitancy, that uncertainty that tells me here's someone who has a much more open mind than maybe another expert with an even higher opinion, a higher reputation. Second point, yeah, I mean, we gravitate towards experts who sound very certain. I want to give one example, though, of someone who is still very active, one of the most famous economists in the US. And I invited him way back in 2008 to take part in a workshop that I was organizing 2008 on the global financial crisis. We were doing a big project. We had 2 workshops. I invited him to one of them, the first one. And I still remember him coming into the room. And that's when the shock hit, you know, with collapsing share prices and so on. Came in and said to me, Joe, you know, I've got this really well understood. And he said, you know, it's going to be a short, sharp recession, but we'll get back quite quickly, and on it goes. And after 2 days, I chatted with him, and he said, you know, Joe, I've changed my mind. It's going to be long and deep. And this is what I admire about that guy, that he was prepared to take his expertise and to revise and to review and to revise his views based on what he had heard. Now, there's a very famous economist, John Maynard Keynes, who once said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? And that's exactly the point I'd like to make here. So we're looking for a particular type of expertise, not the leading expert in a particular discipline, but an expert who can make the connections. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Cole, how would you respond to this question about fostering effective collaboration?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one that I think is integral to success of leading a Foresight project or effort. I'd say first that many times when you're trying to bring in a diverse group, which obviously is integral and the other 2 panels have spoken to, I think there needs to be just a common understanding of Foresight as a practice. So the first step I generally take is aligning people in terms of understanding what Foresight is. And to me, I found a good heuristic for that is around problem framing. So letting people understand the difference between what I would call a type 1, type 2, and type 3 problem. So type 1 problems are clear problem, clear solution. Type 2 problems have a clear problem, but yet an unclear solution. And type 3 problems are unclear problems with unclear solutions. And I think that's really what Foresight is. And so letting people know that this is going to be less about really diving into known knowns, but really exploring unknown unknowns is really integral, I think, in the very beginning from a table setting perspective. And then I think the next piece here is really defining what success looks like and understanding other people's incentive structures. So what are we actually solving for, and how can every individual across this collaboration benefit from the actual Foresight project? So I like to think about this in terms of 2 usually key success factors. One is driving actual insights, and the second is the actual change management effort from going through this process together as a really diverse group, bringing a bunch of different perspectives. And so I think it's really defining success here and letting people understand that you can't predict the future. It's about really elucidating what is happening, helping build the ability to navigate through the moment, and then activating that in a way that can create privileged positioning, adaptability, and preparedness for the future. And so as I think about that, it's really key to have leadership buy-in and support, and really think about what is critical to activation and results to avoid this becoming just solely an intellectual exercise. You know, I think there was a famous quote by Karl Marx who said, philosophers of the past have only tried to interpret the world. The point is to change it. So it's not about just interpreting this, but it's about actually trying to lead to some sort of activation and a better world. And so all of that really is around this view of aligned action, which is building a top-down view and plan and course of action but also realizing that this is a networked grassroots bottom-up revolution that you're really trying to build. So a kind of funny quip that I like to say is one should think about it is, if you were throwing a party, how would you want everyone to join and participate and be a part of that? And I think it's a similar thing here, in that you're trying to build a common understanding of foresight, define what success looks like, realize that it's about actually shaping a beneficial outcome, not just doing an intellectual exercise, and then bringing everyone along on the journey as part of that to really build a grassroots change management revolution within your organization.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for that foundational discussion on developing a foresight approach. Our next question is for Sherelle. Ensuring that strategies are resilient is key to any strategic foresight analysis, but the steep issues, those found in social, technological, environmental, economic, political influences, are changing more rapidly all the time. How do you account for dynamism in strategic foresight? And is there an ideal periodicity to strategic foresight inquiry and analysis?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah, for that question. I think it's a great question, especially the world we're living in today. So the bottom line up front, which is something that I like to run with when it comes to foresight or any level of work in government, right, is foresight is not having a crystal ball that can tell you the future, right? It helps us plan. It helps us be ready and anticipating those changes and emerging trends that we need to be ready for. So ideally, we're doing foresight in the entities that I've worked in, right, to help policymakers make better decisions about the future. Government is known to be slow at reacting to certain things. And so incorporating foresight into these elements is very important. STEEP, now more than ever, like I mentioned, and others have mentioned as well, they're so interconnected that it's really hard to just delineate one bucket at a time, right? All of the work that we've been doing for the past few years, right? And COVID was the impetus of showing how everything is so cross-cutting. There is an impact to all of these issues combined, right? And so how do we account for, this rapid change is very important for us, right? Just being appraised of it, understanding how you're planning for the future, understanding that those changes. And so like I said, it's not a crystal ball. You're not going to have a solution. If you're looking into foresight for instant gratification, it's not going to be the case, right? I know I worked in an effort at the Department of Veterans Affairs regarding changing veterans education vouchers to do online schooling. And this was before COVID, and it wasn't an acceptable practice. Veterans needed to be in school physically in a brick and mortar. It wasn't until later when I left, right, despite having to put out that workshop and putting out the study for it, it wasn't until 6 years later, before COVID, that they were considering that. And then COVID expedited the process of needing to do online education for veterans. And so you're not going to have instant gratification. You're going to be able to look back and realize, hey, we missed that one, right? Or we were actually really prepared for it. How often? It really depends, right? You want to target it to what's important, things that you want to be updating or planning for. So ideally, one of the suggestions I have is continuous. Foresight should be done continuously on a routine basis, having a set core group that is constantly looking at these different buckets that are sharing best practices, learning best practices, networking with others. We're only as smart as the people surrounding us, right? So if we're expanding this network, such as NIASH or the Federal Foresight Community of Interest or different other organizations that we're a part of, we're just learning and growing and getting smarter at some of these things we're anticipating, right? For GAO, our audit work is done every 18 to 24 months. That's how long it takes for our auditors to do a complete audit of a program. For that being our strategic plan in general, we tie a lot of our foresight work to our strategic plan. We've broken up the book into 3 different pieces. One is foresight, the trends that we have, our actual plan, and then the work we're going to be doing, so the audit work. And so why we did that was so that we're able to, despite doing the continuous environmental scanning every year, routine basis, we're just augmenting the work that we've previously done. But we do start at a new baseline approach when we start to kick off the new strategic plan. Every 2 years within GAO, we look at the work that we're going to be doing, which is tied to our audit work, the 18 to 24 month period. And we look at the work that we've completed and the work that we anticipate doing by the emerging trends that we've been exploring for the past 2 years or the last 18 months that we've been looking at it. On a routine basis, we're also informing our folks across GAO about changing trends, about things that are happening within the whole of the environment, not just the United States, but the whole of the world. So for us, we do it on a routine basis, but at the bare minimum, tying it or anchoring it to something like a strategic plan really helps identify what's your baseline and where you're starting from and moving from there. So with that, I will pause there.
Thank you, Sherelle. Our next question is for Cole. Changes in political ideology can have a significant effect on funding support for health and safety research. Are there any special methods that you recommend when conducting a review of possible political trends?
Yes, this is a great topical question right now at our firm. We're starting and just launched a partnership with our government practice to think about the future of government. So this is a very timely question, something that I've been thinking about. I would say, there's a short answer, which would be some of the traditional ways that you would go about thinking about this that are aligned with general foresight practices, which is, you can go on some sort of research journey and think through, looking at a variety of different publications and what thought leaders are saying and what's being, written about by think tanks and other, organizations. And then there's expert interviews and learning journeys. And I think all of those can be very, very valuable in trying to get a pulse of how things are shifting. But another heuristic that I've kind of been thinking about and come up with recently is this thought around small cycles, medium cycles, big cycles, and how those kind of integrate within one another. So I'll give you an example of this is, I think of small cycles as being things that are cyclical or seasonal in some sense. So you can think about, a boom period versus a recession, right? That would be kind of a understanding of what period of a cyclical time period we're within, or larger debt cycles, right? Then I think there's medium cycles that occur. So an example of that would be, there was a period that existed obviously in the Gilded Age, and certain social and political factors necessitated new forms of legislation and policy that came in when we saw the New Deal and the Great Society, right? Then the oil crisis of the 70s and other things led to a new political era of neoliberalism led by the Chicago School and Milton Friedman, for example. And now we're seeing a move post, you could argue, in the beginning of the financial crisis and even up to this point of some form of new progressivism that's coming. And I think all of those are, predicated many times on new forms of technology, the way in which geopolitics is evolving, demographic issues, and how policy and regulation, along with values and cultures, really shift to address that. And then I think you have these big cycles, and I would argue those are the ones like thinking about the shift from the Neolithic era of hunter-gatherer tribal societies to the agrarian age, to the Industrial Revolution, and what I would argue we're now on the precipice of an infotech revolution. And an example of that I would give you is the shift of when the Gutenberg printing press as a technology came about led to such transformation within the social political systems of Europe. And that was, many think, the burgeoning of the Treaty of Westphalia that really established nation states, right? So that you could also think of in terms of digital technology right now, and how that has led to a new form of emergent networked power. I would recommend seeing this book written by a CIA analyst named Martin Gurry called The Revolt of the Public. and he talks about this concept of the fifth wave or the fifth estate, and how, traditionally power resided historically in the three estates, and then the fourth estate is known kind of as the media. And so this new fifth estate of network power that you can see through blogs and Twitter are really establishing new forms of network power. And so I think looking at that in terms of these short cycles, of small, medium, and then broader, large cycles, and realizing how those are giving you signposts and indicators and signals of shifts and change that are occurring, and understanding, that quote of history doesn't really repeat itself, but it does rhyme in many ways. And so thinking about what are the kind of evergreen, everlasting things at the essence of politics that are there, but how they're really transforming and shifting based on the constituent parts of technology and values and culture and policy that are addressing really the challenges of the current era that we're in.
Terrific. Thank you. Our next question is for Cho. With businesses operating in a global context, how do you balance the consideration of global trends with the nuanced impacts of local economic, political, and cultural dynamics in your foresight analysis?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So I'd like to actually address two questions here. One is very closely related to the question you posed, and then I'll get onto your question. And the closely related one is about how do you assess a problem, whatever that problem is, from close up and from further back. And for me, for the work that I've been doing for much of my life in Shell, we've always had a business strategic decision front of mind as to, and it could be on anything. Do we invest in country A? Do we divest out of country B? What's our strategy in country C? What are the new areas of activity that we could get involved with in country D, and so on. And for every exercise I do, there's always that business strategic decision that has to be taken. And I always look for two kinds of people. The ones who are right up against the problem, deeply immersed in the country itself, working at the coalface, and also the ones sitting further back, also focused on the problem, also focused on the country, but from a distance. There's a Chinese writer, Su Jian, who once said that an insider is like a fish in a fishbowl, very knowledgeable about the detail of the water it is swimming in, but it's unable to see the exact shape of its surroundings, even though those surroundings are perfectly clear to everyone else. So you want to have some distance as well. So to see the problem in the round, as well as to see the problem from up close. So that's the first point to make. The second point to make is, when you're doing the detailed work, I would begin actually with the problem at hand and look at it within the context of how it's playing out within its local and domestic context. And then, of course, no country exists in isolation of everyone else. Well, one or two try to do, but generally speaking, most don't. And then you want to actually connect your understanding of that key decision that has to be taken in that country with the wider, broader political, global economy or geopolitical context. That's where you start to address what are the big shifts coming in that will impact on that decision that has to be taken. Now, it won't be everything. It'll be certain elements of that global economy or that geopolitical context, or maybe it's a question to do with shifting technological trends. Whatever it is, you bring in selectively that wider context that you feel is most important for the decision to be taken within the country frame. So that's how I would approach it, and I hope that sort of addresses your question. Okay.
All right, thank you, Cho. Our next question is for Cho and Sherelle. Foresight exercises can be influenced by personal biases and assumptions. how do you identify, challenge, and mitigate these biases to ensure that the outcomes of your foresight efforts are as objective as possible? Joe, would you like to respond first?
Okay, thanks. So what I would say is this. Firstly, I think the greatest danger in looking out for biases and assumptions that we might have are not among the experts that we bring to examine the issue at hand. It's the people who are putting together the scenarios or foresight, whatever methodology we use, as well as the decision maker who has to make a critical decision. Everyone comes with baggage from his or her past. And sometimes we may feel that very, very deeply if with a decision maker, he or she feels very strongly about how a country, what a country's trajectory is going to look like in the future, as well as among the facilitator, maybe myself, if I feel that a particular decision should play out in a certain way, because one way is good and another way is bad. So you have to really try to separate yourself from those biases and those assumptions, because they're really based on not on how the situation looks, but they're based on the mindset that you bring to the problem or the mindset that your decision maker brings to the problem. So in getting together, in putting together people who can help you come to a view on the situation, you need people with different points of view. Obviously, we know that. But with the decision maker, you need to ask yourself, how best can I change his or her mindset so that he or she sees that decision in another light, in a different way? Don't forget what I said earlier about packaging lies. We're trying to change mindsets here rather than looking for fundamental truths. There's a quote again I'd like to share from the management consultant Peter Drucker, who said that the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it is acting with yesterday's logic. Close quote.
Thank you. Sherelle, any thoughts about additional methods or approaches to manage bias?
Sure. So foresight is ideally a science and an art. They exist together, and there is no definitive answer. Like I said, it's not instant gratification. There is, yes, we're human, right? There's always going to be a bias introduction to this. But the way to proposition foresight to decision makers, to those, deciding what the next steps are, is always allowing to surface the opportunities and challenges that a certain scenario or the lack of a decision would have an impact on if this is the emerging trend that we're seeing, right? So for the various organizations that I've worked at, we've had multiple layers of individuals involved. Those that are performing the scans, those that are analyzing those emerging trends, those that are compiling, those scenarios or the storyline, and those that are, pulling everything together and identifying what those challenges and opportunities are. That provides you a more grounded opportunity to understand the different layers, right? It goes through different foresight tools to remove some element of bias, to check your own self, check others' work as well. Because like I mentioned, there's a science and art, right? We try to be as fact-based as we can, but the idea is that foresight, you're not predicting anything. You don't have anything concrete. You can just anticipate and be ready for those items. So a lot of the work that you see in foresight will be blogs, perhaps, right? So it's not concrete, but there's probably a study that will run with that assumption or have some sort of implications of these different emerging trends that we're identifying. So I think it's very important, yes, to have different perspectives, but also to position a decision maker with understanding what are those opportunities, what are those challenges, and what are the risks that would be taken if no action is taken based on these emerging trends.
Thank you. Thank you. And this question is for Cole. Strategic foresight often involves creative thinking and speculation, to Sherelle's point of it being art and science. how do you balance, strike a balance between the imaginative scenario building process and relying on data-driven insights to ensure that your foresight recommendations are both visionary and grounded?
Yes, this is where the magic happens, I think, within Foresight. So this is a great question. I like to keep three, and you can think of them as kind of like the 3 C's in mind, which is, I think any successful Foresight practitioner follows some form of curiosity. I call it collaboration and creativity. And so this question of, creativity is, and where does that come from, or how can you achieve that first part? And I think, to me, in many ways, it's balancing what I'll call as classic enduring knowledge with kind of contemporaneous or current information. So I think one thing that I've found in the best, people that practice foresight, or those that have been mentors in the past, they have just a deep knowledge of a variety of different intersecting knowledge bases. So that's from physics to philosophy to, classic literature, evolution, whatever that is to draw on. So I think that's first, is thinking about how do you find ways in which to cultivate that deep knowledge that is beyond just current events of what's happening, to find ways in which to connect disparate things together. I think there's a set of mindsets that you can practice, which is, the main 3 that I always keep in mind are outside in, future back, and scenario based. So those are 3 ways to avoid kind of just near-term extrapolation. I think of that in the scenarios. For implications, I think you want to be holistic. You kind of want to think from a first principles basis of getting to the deep root of the essence of something, and then think about the second and third order effects of that. And then I think outcomes from that. So scenarios, implications, outcomes, which is tying some sort of narrative thread together so that people can understand, what is the history to date, or, the looking back to look forward. What is the burning platform, or the thing that is really, really important that's causing this change to occur? And then what are the things that are the uncertainties and the things that we feel fairly prudent to assume? But I think all of this is in the goal of giving people a map in which that they can navigate through the future with. And so that takes some form of deep, quiet time to really think and reflect. And, that can be hard in order to prioritize the important over the expedient. But, there's a ton of literature out there around what makes creativity. I think it's some form of being generative. So divergent thinking, overcoming the knowledge constraints of what you have, which some of the panelists have touched on, of having, insider views with outsider views. And then thinking about how to, prioritize and select around that. And that's around, stuff I spoke around defining success and measuring what's important, and understanding the difference between validity versus reliability, which is some metrics are valid, but they can't necessarily be measured. And some things that are measurable aren't necessarily valid. So I think thinking through all of those things, I would say on the creative side is important. From the data-driven perspective, I would say there's no data from the future, and I think that's a thing that we continue to kind of talk about, all 3 of the panelists, full stop on that. And I think it's about cultivating the fact that we're trying to say to others, foresight is around thinking about multiple futures. So it's not going to be some rigorous data-driven proving of some sort of future, because it's more of the activity of building adaptability and agility and preparation for multiple futures. And so I think a lot of that is expectation setting around that. So not to avoid the question, but I think a lot of it is the framing. And then I think it's about finding the amount of data that will validate the story that you're telling, so that people have understanding and agency to act. But I don't think that this is at its core a data-driven pursuit. But I think what it could look like is doing some form of representing the future through the creativity we've spoken about, and backcasting to today and figuring out what are the signals and signposts that I see from that. And then having a forward trajectory future, which is thinking about what data am I seeing that can validate directionally the change that's occurring today. And so your job is really to build that bridge as a union between the backcasting of possible futures to today with signals and signposts, and data-driven forward looking that looks towards where the world is going. And you bridge that then lights that aha to everyone and brings that together into a coherent narrative or a context so that you create mutual understanding for people's ability to act with agency. So that's how I see kind of the full body of these coming together, of balancing that form of creativity and data-driven approach.
Great, thank you. And our last question is for all of you, and to make sure we have time for audience questions, which are coming in, if you could briefly touch on the high points of sharing any specific examples where strategic foresight has significantly changed the course of an organization's strategy and how you measured that tangible impact. Sherelle, would you like to respond first?
Sure. So I mentioned it in one of the other questions, but GAO in 2018 decided to, part of the review of our strategic plan, every strategic plan is about 4 to 5 years within the executive branch. And so for us, as I walked into this new position, I wanted to make sure that our organization was agile and flexible with how Congress was also taking office, presidential elections. And given that we're in the legislative branch, we don't need to adhere to the same executive branch rules, but we do it in the spirit of GIPRA and excuse me, in creating that strategic plan. So by splitting the book up in three books, basically our plan, which looks out for about 4 years, that stays pretty solid. We have our key efforts, which looks at our audit work in the next 18 to 24 months. So it takes the 4-year strategy into an 18 to 24 months. And then we also have our trend book that's supposed to be looking out anywhere from 5 to 10 years, but it gives us the flexibility of changing those emerging trends as we see things happening, right? So in the middle of our strategic plan, during that planning piece of it, COVID did happen, right? And so lucky for us, we were able to quickly understand any of the emerging trends that were happening with regards to COVID. And we were able to address some of our audit work within those 18 to 24 month period by shifting some of the work that we were doing. Ultimately, our GAO plan has been a 2-time awarded plan. And so I think that's one of the biggest success stories for us, is making sure that we're agile by incorporating foresight and taking what is the grand plan and splitting it up into pieces so that we can be more flexible and agile to respond to Congress and the American people.
Thank you. Paul, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so Foresight has been integral to Deloitte as an organization. As I mentioned, we have our goal and our mandate is to future-proof Deloitte as an organization and to help other organizations do the same. And so we're fortunate enough to have really great dialogue and connection with our key leadership, from the CEO to the board to our exco. But one example of that I can just give that is literally starts from the very top of our firm is during our Future of Consumer that we did in partnership with our consumer industry leadership. One of the things that during our narrative framing came out was this concept of sustainable abundance, which is to say that, since the beginning of time, human beings have been seeking to replace natural scarcity and privation with further forms of abundance. We're now reaching a point in which that we still have millions of people globally that we need to bring online to have further abundance, but also reaching a point in which we're hitting some of the carrying capacity on our planet of things that can be done in a sustainable manner. And so we have this creative tension here between two things, but realizing that they're actually, there's the quote that innovation, that necessity is the mother of all innovation. And so there's a necessity here to solve this problem. And so are those diametrically opposed from one another? I think that's been maybe an orthodoxy that may not necessarily be the case. And so this entire point of view is really around the thought that they need not be antithetical to one another, but that we can have sustainability and abundance through a new innovation agenda. And so the goal is basically using innovation to bring those two things together. And this has now become the North Star of our firm. There will be a paper about this published between our US CEO and our chief futurist, who is my boss, Amy Kelly, really laying that out as the guiding North Star and vision for our firm moving forward. So that came out of a Foresight related project. I don't think it was something that any of us expected, nor that the CEO asked for, but it is something that will have obviously huge implications for our organization and comes from the very top of the house within Deloitte.
And Cho, final brief comments about this question?
Hi, Sarah. Well, let me try and be brief, but I'm afraid this might take just a little while to go through, because when you ask that question, I've been almost 30 years in the Shell Scenarios team, and the Scenarios team itself has been in existence for over half a century. So there's a long list of successes that I could go into or could choose from, just as there's also a list of failures, if I could put it that way, which are carefully, discreetly filed away and not referred to again. So we always like to talk about our successes. But there is one success which came right at the start of the Shell Scenarios team's history, which has within the company attained almost iconic folklore quality of the power of foresight and of scenarios, but it's not quite what it seems. And there's a lesson for us in that tale today. So the lesson is that the head of strategy at the time, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, had a powerful insight about the energy industry at that time. So think about the 1960s. It was all to do with oil. It was all to do with oil supply. And what he argued was, his insight was that everything being equal, the power in terms of oil would shift to the Middle East producing countries. Now, where he got traction was in developing scenarios which laid out that insight to the senior decision makers in the company, and that led to, as it were, to different action being taken and so on and so forth. Now that's, in a way, a summary of a more nuanced situation, because what actually happened, if you look back to the late 60s and early 70s, was that actually this was all perfectly obvious. A very active debate was taking place that producer power was shifting to the Middle East, oil producing countries, while on the other side of the equation, oil demand in the industrial world, at that time it was entirely the Western world plus Japan, was just ramping up inexorably. And if you look at august publications like Foreign Affairs, you'll see lots of learned articles being written sounding the alarm bell about this. But no one, and this is interesting, no one was taking heed of that in oil company boardrooms, or for that matter, in the US government at the time. So the point about the foresight work, which Ted Newland led at the time, was not in some incredible insight that he had gained from foresight, but was actually stating the obvious things that people outside of the business were already discussing very heatedly, getting the message across to shift the mindsets of key decision makers inside the company. So that was critical. We're talking here about shifting mindsets, and that's fundamental to any foresight work that we do today. Just think about the problems that we face today, which we deny. Inevitably, tomorrow they will force change on us. The question is, how prepared are we in advance of that change to be able to act on it? So the key here is shaping the mindsets of the key decision makers, and encouraging them to act. One last point, if I may, because we're having this webinar at a time when great events are playing out in the Middle East. And the question that really been bugging me is, why was it with the scale of the attack that we saw from Hamas on Israel, 1,000, 2,000, I don't know how many terrorists from Hamas entered the country and managed to do what they did? How was that possible, given the scope and the scale of Israeli intelligence on Hamas? And I can only think of one reason, which is that they must have got some signs, some signals of what was brewing, but they did not connect the dots because it did not fit the preconceived mentality, the preconceived ideas that they already had about the situation, and on which they were, I have to say in retrospect, pretty complacent about. So there's the same parallel. In this case, it was a failure of foresight to actually pick up or intelligence to pick up that threat in advance. But is that belief in a fixed mentality? It comes back to Peter Drucker's point about acting with the mentality of the past, because of course the world moves on. Thanks.
Thank you very much. This concludes the pre-selected questions for our panel, and certainly on behalf of NIOSH, I want to thank you for your participation in this and the wonderful insights and experience that you've been able to share with us today.